So last week we started doing a little overview of the Constitution, and I mentioned how I'm going to go into specifics about it. So I'll start today's show with doing that. We're going to talk about part of Article 1 of the Constitution, which is the legislative branch. So remember when we're talking about the Constitution, this is the governing document for the federal government. Okay, it's not about the governing document for state governments. Now, there are a few things in the Constitution that kind of limits state government power, but this is the governing document for the federal government. The states have their own constitutions that govern their state governments. So, for example, Minnesota has its own constitution that governs the state government. So, we're going to be talking about the federal government here for when I'm doing the series on the Constitution. So, let's start with Article 1, which is the legislative branch. So, each of when you go through and read the Constitution, each one of the articles has further subdivisions of sections and clauses. So, I'm going to be talking about some of those too. But that's kind of how they divided up the Constitution. So, in Article 1, Section 1, this is where the Constitution sets up Congress. Okay, it says Congress is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they have the legislative power given to them. So that's one of the shortest sections in the Constitution, but it was short and sweet, and that's what gives the power to Congress, and it sets up the two chambers in our Congress. Remember, this is part of the great compromise I spoke about last week, where they made a deal between the big states and the little states to have two separate chambers in Congress. So that's why we have the House and the Senate. It's right in Article 1, Section 1. So this was part of the compromise between the big and the small states. So the big states kind of won on the House, and the small states won when it comes to the Senate. So I'll be talking more about that on a future show, too. So that's Section 1, short and sweet. Section 2 is about the House of Representatives. Okay, so after I do this one, Section 3 is about the Senate. So you see how they kind of separate each chamber here, and they're going to talk and give some specific powers and rules and those sorts of things to each, the House and the Senate. So Section 2 is about the House. So Clause 1 is where they set up the term to be 2 years. So every 2 years we have an election for the House of Representatives, the entire House. And in the Constitution it says the people vote for that. So every 2 years, that's how long the terms are in the House. So it also says that the states basically set the laws for who gets to vote. One thing I'll be talking about in future shows is about how state laws basically govern elections. There are some federal laws, but a lot of it is state laws. So back then, at this time, when this was basically adopted in 1788, 1789, the only people who could vote under these state laws were basically white male property owners, or sometimes the white male taxpayers who are at least 21 years old, depending on what the state law is. So those are the only people who could vote. So again, it wasn't everybody. Okay, it was very limited at that time as to who could vote. Clause 2 then sets up the qualifications to run for the House of Representatives. So you need to be 25 years old or older. So I could run for the House if I wanted to. A citizen for at least 7 years. So I've met that one too. And live in the state that the seat that you're running for is in. So notice one thing here. It doesn't say that you have to live in the congressional district that you're running in. Okay, it just says you got to live in the state. So if somebody in Minneapolis, let's say, congressional district number 4, if they want to run, if that's where they live, but they want to run for the 7th district out in the, basically the entire western part of the state of Minnesota, they can do that. Now they might not win if they don't live out there, but all you got to do is live in the state in order to run for the House. So you can run anywhere, any of the 8 districts that we currently have. Clause 3 then says that the number of the House members shall be apportioned, which basically means divided up, among the states based on their population. And initially, with the Constitution, slaves and other people, basically non-white people, were counted as 3/5 of a person. So again, that no longer is part of our Constitution, but initially it was. Clause 3 also mandates a census every 10 years to set the number of representatives in each state, based on the population that comes about as a census. So that's one reason why we have a census every 10 years, is we use that to figure out how many people in the House of Representatives each state gets. So right now Minnesota has 8. In the last 2020 census, we nearly went down to 7. But we skated by with 8 again. The last couple census we have, but we almost lost one this last census. So initially, when the Constitution was first ratified, it set the number of representatives basically 1 for every 30,000 people in the United States at that time. Now, that certainly doesn't work now. But what happened in 1929, Congress passed a federal law that said the maximum number is going to be 435 people in the House. That's how we ended up with 435 people in the House now. Okay? So it's still, you still have to figure out based on your state populations how to divide up to 435. But that's what the number is set at this point. Initially, the Constitution did set out how many representative each state gets, and when you add all those up, it was 65 members in the House, and then it was divided up by the population of the state. So Virginia had the most with 10 in it. Clause 4 then says that when a vacancy occurs during the term, so if like somebody dies or somebody quits or somebody gets impeached, which hardly ever happens, state law then governs how you fill that vacancy. So many of the states have laws where there's a special election to fill that House seat. Some states have it where the governor of the state appoints somebody to finish out the term until the next election. So it kind of depends on what your state law is, but I think most states have that special election provision where the governor of the state picks a day according to their state law, and then you have a special election. Clause 5 says that the House members choose a Speaker of the House. So there's a majority vote there. So currently that's Mike Johnson, a Republican from, I think he's from Louisiana, is the current Speaker of the House. And they can pick other officers. Clause 5 also says that all impeachments have to start in the House of Representatives. So this is why when Trump was impeached twice, it started out in the House. So there's a majority vote for impeachment here. So I kind of use an analogy with impeachment, like if you're getting charged by the police or by a prosecutor with some sort of crime, they tell you what they are, they kind of lay out the facts, that kind of thing. That's what basically the House does with impeachment. It lays out what they think the president or some other, it can be any federal officer did, and then you have a trial in the Senate. Okay, so Section 3 then is about the Senate. Clause 1 sets the term of office for senators at 6 years. And it also says that each state gets 2 senators. So as I mentioned in the last week, there are some attempts to try and get Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. admitted as states. So if that happens, we would get 4 more senators, which at this point would help the Democrats probably. But that's Clause 1 of Section 3 is each state gets 2 senators, and there's a 6-year term. So because it's a 6-year term, You have about a third of the Senate is up every 2 years for election. So, for example, Amy Klobuchar is up this year. It's her turn out of her 6-year term. It's her time to run for election again. So, at that point, when the Constitution was adopted, the people could not vote for a senator like we do now. The Constitution said that the state legislatures would pick the 2 senators from their state. So this was changed by the 17th Amendment in 1913, which then allowed the people to vote directly for the Senate. So for a while, the people didn't vote for senators. It was the state legislature that picked them. So similar to the House, the Section 3 mentions that if there's a vacancy in the Senate, then whichever state that the vacancy occurs in, they get to fill it until the next election. And typically with the Senate, it's a little bit different, I think, in a lot of the states where the governor just appoints somebody to fill the term. I don't believe there's too many states that have a special election for Senate. I think the governor just does the appointment. So Clause 3 then of Section 3 on the Senate sets the qualifications to run for Senate. You got to be 30 years old, a citizen for 9 years, and you got to live in the state that you're running in. So it's kind of similar to the House in that there's an age requirement, a citizenship requirement, and you got to live in the state. So you got to be a little bit older and live in the United States a little longer to run for Senate. Now, one thing to notice here about the House and the Senate qualifications, it says nothing about prior experience. Okay, it just says you got to be a certain age and you got to be a citizen for so long, and you got to live in the state you're running in. That's it. As I'll talk about in the future show, there's basically the same thing goes for president. I mean, there's no experience requirement in here. So that's why there isn't any. And pretty much anybody can run as long as you meet these simple requirements. So Clause 4 then says that the vice president is the president of the Senate, meaning that person basically presides and runs the Senate. Is like the ceremonial head of the Senate. But the vice president can only vote when there is a tie. Once everybody else that's there votes, if there's a tie vote, the vice president then votes to break the tie. Otherwise, the vice president does not have a vote. So actually, most of the time, the vice president isn't even there, unless they think the vote's going to be close. Then they show up. But Clause 5 says that the Senate can choose their own officers and that they can pick a president pro tempore, which is basically a temporary president that serves, presides over the Senate when the vice president is not there, which again is most of the time. So in the Senate, the majority leader, which is basically the head of the majority party in the Senate, runs the show in the Senate. So it's kind of their version of the Speaker of the House. So currently, Chuck Schumer, a Democrat from New York, is the Senate majority leader because the Democrats have a 51-49 advantage in the Senate. So moving on to Clause 6 then. This is where it says the Senate does the actual impeachment trial. So if the trial is for the president, like it was with Trump, the Supreme Court justice presides at the trial. If it is somebody other than the president, the Senate basically can pick who they want to preside. But the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court has to do the president. So John Roberts was present during both of the impeachment trials, although they weren't really trials, of Trump. And the Senate needs 2/3 of those present to convict and remove the federal officer from office. So if all 100 are there, let's just assume that, you need 67 to vote to convict somebody after the trial and then kick them out of office. So Trump, of course, was not convicted either time because we couldn't get 67, because most of the Republicans voted against convicting him. So the Democrats couldn't get up to 67. So this is why Trump skated both times during his impeachments, because the Republicans controlled the Senate at that time. And at that time, Mitch McConnell, he was the head of the Senate, basically said, well, we don't need a trial. We're just going to do you can say, you can make your arguments and file your papers, but we're not going to hear from any witnesses or anything. And there wasn't even really a trial. I'll talk about that here later, too. So that's Clause 6. Clause 7 then gives the penalties if you are convicted after the impeachment trial. So you are removed from office, and you are disqualified from holding any other federal office in the future. So this is why a lot of people were hoping Trump would get impeached so that he couldn't run for president anymore. Well, he couldn't. Not only couldn't he run for president anymore, he couldn't hold any federal office. Now, he could hold a state office if he wanted to, because the Constitution doesn't say anything about that, unless your state constitution says something different. But you can't hold any federal office in the future if you are impeached. Plus, Clause 7 also says that the person can also be dealt with in the regular court system, according to law. So this is why Trump is now he was criminally charged with a variety of cases. He's also involved in some civil cases where he was, for example, adjudicated a rapist of E. Jean Carroll and lost a defamation lawsuit she brought. So even if you're impeached, you can still be brought to regular court. So when it involves Trump, we're going to see if the Supreme Court immunity decision, which again I think is pretty unsound constitutionally, whether that's going to let him off of anything. But Jack Smith just filed a new case where he left out some of the stuff which arguably might be official acts of Trump, but there's plenty of other stuff that is out there that he might get convicted with. So Section 4 then deals with congressional elections, where it says Congress can set the time for federal elections. So Congress made a law that said, well, it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. That's Elections Day. So this year it's November 5th because it's the first Tuesday after the first Monday. Clause 2 says that Congress has to meet at least once a year. So Congress has passed a law that says January 3rd at noon is when they meet each year, unless they change the date for some reason. Section 5 is about how the House and the Senate run themselves. So they get to set their own rules. And they get to change them if they want, for how they conduct business and for how they can, punish members. So if you want to expel somebody like George Santos was in the House not too long ago, you need 2/3 to expel somebody. So that part's actually in Section 5 of the Constitution. And it also says that the House or the Senate has to record their votes. And it also says they have to meet in the same city. So this is why they both meet in Washington, D.C. now. And then Section 6, which is the last one that I'm going to cover here, is about rights of the members. So they get to be paid from the Treasury. If you're in the House, you get $174,000 a year. If you're in the Senate, you get $174,000 a year. If you're an officer in either one, you get like $20,000 more. They can't be arrested while they're doing their duties there at Washington, D.C. And then when they get up and talk, they can pretty much say what they want. They can't be charged with a crime, when they're based on what they're saying. Clause 2 of Section 6 says that you can't, if you're in the House or the Senate, you can't have another federal job. It also contains the emoluments clause for the House and the Senate, meaning they're not supposed to get additional compensation because of their job. My guess is that a lot of them do. This just isn't being enforced. Trump did this when he was the president. I'm guessing that the House and the Senate members do this too, but based on the Supreme Court decisions which have legalized bribery of politicians, saying that there's that it's free speech, you're not going to see much there. So I'm going to stop here with for this part, and next week I'll start talking more about Article 1.